action.
Okay, first term on here is white and gray matter. Now you guys know that, right? If we just separate the brain, the cerebrum, you see the white matter is mostly on the inside. The gray matter is in pink here. It's where the nerve cell bodies are in the cortex of the brain on the outside. There also are cerebral nuclei deep in the brain, and those are the basal ganglia. Also, the thalamus is a nucleus down deep in the brain. But that's the white matter. Then the gray matter is where the predominantly nerve cell bodies are. The white matter is where it's predominantly nerve fibers, which are mostly axons in the white matter. It's whitish when it's not stained because the white matter, the myelin of the axons has sort of a fatty white appearance, and so it looks lighter colored than the gray matter, which has more nerve cell bodies. Now, a sulcus is a groove. So when you look at the brain, the striking thing about it is that it's wrinkles that have grooves between them. So the wrinkles are called gyri. A single one would be a gyrus, but the multiple ones, plural, is gyri. Then the grooves are called sulci in plural. In singular, it would be sulcus or sulci. Now, an important gyrus is the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus on either side of the central sulcus. So how do we identify that? When you look at the brain, it looks like everything is random as far as the wrinkles, but if you've looked at it a lot, you start to see sort of patterns to the brain. So on this brain, we see the pattern of the gyri kind of going in this direction, and then all of a sudden we sort of see that they're sort of coming down together. And so here they're going this way, here they're coming down together. So then this would be a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus on either side of a central sulcus. On this one, it looks like it's back quite a ways. So they have it back in here deep. So it's a precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, central sulcus. Let's look at this brain, which is maybe done a little bit differently depending on who the manufacturer is. But on this, they make it real clear for us. You see these wrinkles going this way? Mm-hmm. And then these go this way. So here's precentral, postcentral, and that's central sulcus. That separates the larger frontal lobe then from the parietal lobe, that central sulcus. This is a longitudinal fissure, this one, that separates the two hemispheres of the brain, different than the central sulcus, which is going this way. The cingulate gyrus is a gyrus that lays right on top of the corpus callosum on the inside. So here's the corpus callosum. Mm-hmm. See that? And then here's a gyrus that lays on top. This is part of the limbic system. On this side, here's the gyrus laying on top of the corpus callosum. And so that's the cingulate gyrus. Its name is. Okay, the medulla oblongata is then the continuation of the spinal cord through the foramen magnum. That would be this part of the brain, the medulla oblongata. So it's a continuation of the spinal cord, first part of the brain stem, medulla oblongata. Things that we want to point out on that are, first of all, the pyramids. What an odd name, the pyramids, because really the pyramids are two tubular structures. Where we get pyramid from that, nobody knows, because the terms are so old. But these are the pyramids. If you cut it in cross-section, it looks kind of triangular in shape, but I don't think that's the origin of the word. It is tied to the axons of large pyramidal cells in the motor cortex descending here, but I doubt that the Greeks had that figured out either. So nobody really knows why they're called the pyramids, because they look like tubes, but those are the pyramids. You see the tube here and tube here in the front of the medulla? Okay, then the olives are the little bulges on either side. This is a cranial nerve that they're trying to show, but there's a bulge here of tissue if you look, and that's the olive on the inside right here. It looks kind of like a Mediterranean olive, not like the olives we have in America a lot of times with red pimentos in them, but it is more of a flat-looking structure. On this structure, this would be the pyramid, then this would be the olive, this bulge here. You have a cranial nerve on either side of the olive. We'll learn those in a little bit. Then the nucleus cuneatus and gracilis are not really shown on these models, but they're bulges at the top of the medulla on the back, but the detail of this model isn't really good to reveal them. But on the back of the medulla here, you'll have bumps. 1, 2, 3, 4 bumps going across the back. That's nucleus cuneatus and gracilis. Those are the nuclei that are receiving the axons in the dorsal columns of the spinal cord coming up. That would be for light touch and proprioception. Would be synapsing on those nuclei. So there's 4 bulges, and then the axons of those cells will go to the thalamus. and then from there to the cortex. The pons now, the pons rolling means the bridge, and so the Greeks imagined that this structure bridged the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. That's called the pons. It really doesn't, though. These fibers going in are largely fibers coming from the central nervous system, synapsing the pons, and then going into each hemisphere of the cerebellum, not connecting the two hemispheres. And that's the middle cerebellar peduncle. The superior cerebellar peduncle is, or the inferior cerebellar peduncle is fibers coming up from the spinal cord, from the periphery of the body, informing the cerebellum about things happening out in the periphery. That's the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So the middle cerebellar peduncle from the brain, and the middle cerebellar peduncle from the brain, the inferior one from the nerves of the body coming into the cerebellum from down here. It's not really enough detail to really have me point that out very well. The middle cerebellar peduncle, separate from the inferior cerebellar peduncle. It just has one big connection. The superior cerebellar peduncle goes out the upper part of the pons, going into the midbrain to synapse, largely on the red nucleus, and then that sends fibers down the spinal cord that will adjust for coordination movements. The mesencephalon now is the midbrain. You see that in sagittal section. This is the mesencephalon, or midbrain, right here. In the midbrain, then, we refer to the corpora quadragemina. Now, corpora means corp means body, and corpora in Latin are multiple bodies. Corpora. The corpora quadragemina refers to four, and Gemini means twin. So the four twin bodies are these right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those make up the tectum of the midbrain, or the roof of the midbrain, because under that is the cerebral aqueduct. The corpora quadragemina is the roof to the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle here to the fourth ventricle here, which would be under the cerebellum. So that's the cerebral aqueduct going through the midbrain. The corpora quadragemina is the four nuclei here, which are called colliculi. The two lower ones are the inferior colliculi. The two upper ones are the superior colliculi of the corpora quadragemina. Okay, now let's see if we can put this back together. This will be your quiz. If you can put this together in 10 seconds or less, then you'll pass. No, just kidding. Let's see now. I can do it. Back together here. Put the cerebellum back in place. Now we're good to go again. So now, diencephalon is the upper part of just above the brain stem. The diencephalon, maybe I put it together too soon, is the core of the cerebrum. So this area here is the diencephalon. Here we put the insular cortex on, but this really is the diencephalon. It's like an egg on the medial side here. So if you can imagine an egg, here's the side of the egg, here's the back of the egg. Can you imagine an egg here? This is the thalamus, this egg. This area here in front of the thalamus, heading down toward the optic chiasm, this is the hypothalamus. Thalamus, hypothalamus. And these make up the diencephalon. There's also an epithalamus and a subthalamus, and we're not going to deal with those. The pineal gland is this little pink thing right here at the top of the corpora quadragemina. That's the pineal gland, which is an important part of, it's called the epithalamus, but also part of the diencephalon. But for you, I'm asking you to learn the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And those are made up of a lot of smaller nuclei. The telencephalon then is everything that mushrooms out above the diencephalon. That's the telencephalon. And that's the mass of the cerebral hemispheres. Although the diencephalon is also part of the cerebrum, the telencephalon is the larger part. So the telencephalon is especially large in humans. And that's sort of a processing area of the brain for processing things. The cerebral cortex is where most of the gray matter for processing conscious information is happening in the cortex. The cerebral nuclei are areas of nerve cell bodies deep in the cerebrum, which also have functions, the basal ganglia and the thalamus. The cerebellum means the little brain, and these two things here on the back of the brainstem make up the cerebellum. When we talk about the cerebellum, we talk about the arbor vitae, and so looking inside, it kind of looks like a tree, doesn't it? Tree of life. The branches of the tree would be the white matter, and then the foliage would be like the gray matter, and that's called the arbor vitae of the cerebellum. The vermis means the worm. The central area of the cerebellum is functionally slightly different than other parts, and so it's worth naming. And we're not going to go into detail of the cerebellum in this class, but if I hold the cerebellum like this, if it didn't have that saw line down the middle, this structure, would it kind of look like a worm to you? And so that's where the name comes from. The vermis means the worm. And so the central portion of the cerebellum is called the vermis in the region there. Now, the lobes of the brain, this is the cerebral hemispheres. The lobes of the brain are 4. The largest of the lobes is the frontal lobe. So we already said the frontal lobe is from the central sulcus forward. So this is the frontal lobe here, under the frontal bone. This is where motor activity is processed. This is where you make the decisions on how to respond to sensory information that you've collected. That's the frontal lobe. This is the parietal lobe, which is underneath the parietal bone here. And this is where you're processing, first of all, sensory touch, tactile sense. So the precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. The postcentral gyrus is where things come first in the cortex about pain, temperature, warm, cold, temperature, or proprioception, or vibration sense. That's all in the postcentral gyrus. And you can make a map of the whole body here. On the precentral gyrus, you make a map of the whole body. You could stimulate this to cause muscles to move in different parts of the body. The postcentral gyrus, you could stimulate and create sensations in different parts of the body in a conscious person. So that's the postcentral and precentral gyrus. And those are either side of the central sulcus. So this is frontal lobe. This is parietal lobe for tactile sense. It's also an integration area for hearing, vision, and tactile sense together. You also have language centers in this part of the brain, the parietal lobe. The temporal lobes are like the thumb of the mitten. So if this is the mitten, here's the thumb. And here's the temporal lobe. The place for processing auditory information or sound is right here, and an association area for that surrounds it. And then streams go out from it to process it, especially through the language area when you're looking at letters for reading. The occipital lobe is the very back lobe, under the occipital bone. Here's the occipital lobe in the back. Now this is really for processing visual stimuli, especially along the calcarine fissure. A student here has made sure we knew where the calcarine fissure was by running his pin on there. But that'd be this horizontal fissure right here, the calcarine sulcus, or the calcarine fissure. And this is where the primary visual cortex is, as well as the tip. And then you process it as you spread it out through the occipital lobe, and then it goes in streams, 2 streams from this way and this way, for processing visual information in the cortex. So that's the occipital lobe. Okay, the temporal lobe is separated from the rest of the brain, the thumb of the mitten, by what's called a lateral cerebral fissure, right there. Now, cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are not too bad on this brain. I think they're pretty easy to see. Let's start with 1, the olfactory nerve right here. And this lays on top of the cribriform plate, and this is to collect axons from the nasal epithelium with regard to smell. It goes into an olfactory area in the cerebrum, just behind it where these white lines are coming back. This olfactory bulb sits on the cribriform plate. Number 2 is the optic nerve. It crosses here. Can you see it crossing? It's optic chiasm. And that's taking back the information from the retina of the eye. Now, half of the fibers in each side cross because each eye has a left and right field of vision. And so you process your left field of vision in your right hemisphere and your right field of vision in your left hemisphere, and so both eyes report to both hemispheres. And so they have to cross here. So some fibers will go to each hemisphere. The oculomotor nerve is right back here. You just barely see a white thing back here behind the pituitary. That's the oculomotor nerve, and that's cranial nerve 3. So that's the one that moves most of the eye muscles. Then the trochlear nerve is the only one that comes from the back of the brainstem. So if we take off the cerebellum, we can see the trochlear nerve coming from the back side. Right below the corpora quadrigemina, here comes the trochlear nerve. Now, in some models, it'll come all the way to the front, but in this one, they only show it coming this far. Then the trigeminal nerve is this big one coming out of the lateral side of the pons. Remember, the trigeminal means the 3 twins, so that has the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular portions to it, so it's a big nerve. It's a big sensory nerve from the face. It also has a motor compartment for the muscles of mastication. That's the trigeminal nerve, number 5. 3 twins, it means tri-gemini, means twins. Trigeminal nerve is 3 twins, and that's the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular divisions. Then the abducent nerve, we go back to the midline. Now, depending on the author, it's going to be called the abducens or the abducent nerve, either way. The abducens is midline, at the top of the pyramids. Remember the pyramids? Here's the abducens nerve. This is another eye muscle controller, and this innervates the lateral rectus muscle. The trochlear nerve, that's right. The trochlear nerve over here on the side innervates the superior oblique muscle. The oculomotor innervates all the others. Now we go laterally in a line between the pons and medulla. Here's 6, then here's 7. 7 is out here. That's the facial nerve. And that's going to control motor to facial expression. Also has a sensory component called the chorda tympani to the anterior part of the tongue for taste. Then behind that you have 8. Cranial nerve 8 is a big one here. Cranial nerve 8 is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. So that goes to the inner ear and gives you a vestibular nerve for balance and equilibrium, and a cochlear nerve for hearing. Then we go down on the outside of the olive. So it looks like there's a bunch of little rootlets, and the upper ones form the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve comes from the word vagabond, which means the wanderer, because it goes all over the place. It's a parasympathetic nerve. It's preganglionic parasympathetics. And it goes out the foramen magnum. That's the vagus, and then just below it, that's the glossopharyngeal. The glossopharyngeal is the back of the tongue and the throat. Mostly a sensory nerve, but there are some motor components for swallowing on it too. The glossopharyngeal is 9, and then 10 is the vagus. Vagus goes to the throat, the esophagus, and the airways of the lungs, and the heart, and then in the abdomen it goes to the stomach, the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum, the cecum, the ascending colon, and the transverse colon. All there, to all of those organs. Also, it goes to the pancreas, and to the spleen, and the liver. So it's going to a lot of things. That's the vagus nerve. Then 11 is the spinal accessory. So coming up from the spinal cord, you've got this nerve coming up, which is the spinal accessory. So it's coming up like this on the other side. It's going to come into the cranium and then go out again through the jugular foramen with 9 and 10. That's the spinal accessory coming up from below. On this one you can see it a little bit there. On this one you can see it a little bit here, coming up from the spinal cord. Then for 12, these are spinal nerves here. Then for 12, we jump back in front of the olive, and that's the hypoglossal, which is this nerve here. That's 12, and that goes straight out the foramen magnum through the hypoglossal canal to the back of the tongue. And that innervates all the muscles of the tongue. All good? Functional areas then. So the auditory area for sound, we said, was right here on the temporal lobe, and then for processing it around that. The somatomotor area would be the precentral gyrus. The somatosensory area would be the postcentral gyrus, either side of the central sulcus. The visual area would be the occipital lobe along the calcarine sulcus on the inside. So here's marked with pink on this one. This is the calcarine fissure, or calcarine sulcus, and that's the primary visual cortex. The olfactory area just goes into the cerebrum, back behind where this nerve seems to end. It's the only sensation we have that does not go through the thalamus, but goes directly into the cerebrum, into the cortex, rather, of the cerebrum. Facial recognition area is just an area on the bottom of the temporal lobe where you're going to be sensitive to facial recognition, down here. The premotor area is an area in front of the precentral gyrus. So out in this area is a premotor area which actually guides the motor cortex as far as what to do. The common integrative area is in the parietal lobe, where you have a lot of sound, sight, and touch all coming together, and you're processing all of this together in sort of a common integrative area in this area. The prefrontal area is a special area in the frontal lobe where you're making decisions about behavior. Now, this is especially large in humans, and it's very important for complex social behavior, like folkways and mores are kind of here. What's appropriate socially is up here. So this controls the limbic system. So if you have patients who are damaged here, they are often going to do things that might be shocking or inappropriate for your understanding. They might lose their modesty. They might say things to you that you're shocked by. Or they might be unable to control their emotions and go from rage to laughter to tears within a short period of time. And that prefrontal is kind of managing all of those things. The old-fashioned, you've heard of prefrontal lobotomy, used to be done for troublemakers in asylums and people who were hard to manage personalities, or just disconnected the personality controlling part of the brain. But people don't do that anymore. But this is the prefrontal area that was addressed to that, right there. All right? The choroid plexus is just found in the ventricles of the brain. So the cavities of the brain. Here's the choroid plexus. It's illustrated in blue in this model here. That's inside the ventricles. Makes the cerebrospinal fluid, which goes through the ventricles, escapes out into the subarachnoid space, and then is reabsorbed in the dural sinuses and veins in the spinal cord. Okay, you know that probably these are not on the models as well. Down here, but these are the ones that are best shown, as what we've done so far are the ones best shown on the models.
Okay.
Cerebral aqueduct we already did through the middle of the midbrain, right? Fourth ventricle is underneath the cerebellum, right here. So the lateral ventricles are on either side within the cerebrum. The third ventricle is right here between the two halves of the thalamus. Here's the cerebral aqueduct. Here's the fourth ventricle underneath the cerebellum right here. The foramen of Magendie is the median aperture, and the foramen of Luschka are the lateral apertures. So escaping from the fourth ventricle, in the midline there's an aperture where it escapes into the subarachnoid space, and then there's two lateral apertures escaping on either side of that ventricle to get into the subarachnoid space. The foramen of Monroe is interventricular foramen, and so that's where the two lateral ventricles open into the third ventricle. It's right in this area. It's not really shown on the model very well, but it would be coming from the lateral ventricle into the third ventricle, and it would be right here, the foramen of Monroe. Pituitary gland is this thing, by a stalk connected to the hypothalamus, right here. The basal ganglia are the nuclei deep inside the brain, not shown well in these models. Lentiform nucleus is the globus pallidus and putamen, and those are best seen with a picture of a sagittal or a horizontal section through the brain. You can see those nuclei deep down in there, part of the basal ganglia. The meninges are not on the model. Those are just the membranes covering it. And the spaces would correspond to that. The mammillary bodies are these two little bumps here on the bottom of the hypothalamus. Let's see if we put it together if we can find them here. Make them clear. set this down and put this one together. Putting this together now. The mammillary bodies are these white, they're painted white in this model, but there are two little bulges down here. They're painted white, and those are part of the hypothalamus. They're actually the end of what's called the fornix, which is a little more detail than you need to know, but those little bulges there are the mammillary bodies down in there. Not to be confused with cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor, which is white things just above it, there. That's the oculomotor nerve there. Those are the mammillary bodies there. Can you see with this pointer? Is it too big? Mammillary bodies, oculomotor nerve. Kind of close together. Okay, is that good?
Sweet.